Chapters 13 and 14 of Anybody But Anne by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 13. An adjournment. I can tell you nothing in the way of facts that you do not already know, I said. But I wish to say that I entirely coincide with Miss Van Wyck's opinion that her father ended his own life. It is not incredible that his very erratic mind gave way at the last. Nor is it surprising that he should destroy the deed and hide the pearls under stress of sudden insanity. And what is your theory regarding the manner of his death? I have no definite theory, but I wish to call attention to the fact that I found several shot on the floor at Mr. Van Wyck's feet. My statement produced quite a sensation in the audience, for the suggestion of shot seemed to imply at least a possible method of the crime. But the detective, Mr. Markham, interrupted me and said quietly, "It is not worth while, Mr. Coroner, to waste time in consideration of the shot. There is a small receptacle on Mr. Van Wyck's desk, filled with that same shot used as a pen cleaner. I observed that the shot found on the floor was the same, and I have no doubt it was spilled by accident." The coroner turned to Dr. Mason and inquired if Mr. Van Wyck's death could have been brought about by shot. "No," replied the doctor positively. "I probed the wound and found no bullet or shot. David Van Wyck was stabbed, and the weapon was afterward withdrawn. I cannot subscribe to the icicle theory, though I do not say it would be impossible. But the deceased was most assuredly not shot." I felt crestfallen and a little ashamed; for having picked up the shot I should have noticed the same among the furnishings of the desk. The coroner asked me only a few more questions of relative unimportance, and was about to dismiss me when he added as an afterthought, "When did you last see Mr. Van Wyck alive?" It was the query I had been dreading; but there was nothing for it except to tell the truth. Involuntarily I glanced at Anne, but her eyes were cast down and she paid no heed to me. "Of course I was with him at dinner," I said, "and after dinner he left us to go to the study. After that I saw him a moment, when from the terrace I glanced in at the study window." "You glanced in? For what purpose?" "No particular purpose. Mrs. Van Wyck and I were strolling by and merely chanced to look in." "What was Mr. Van Wyck doing?" "Conferring with the committee from the village, I assumed. We could not hear his words, of course, nor did we try to." "What was Mr. Van Wyck's apparent attitude?" "He seemed to be angry," I felt myself obliged to say. "Angry at the gentlemen of the committee?" I was indeed sorry to give this evidence, but I was forced to do it. To decline to answer would be absurd, and after all, everybody knew that Morland and his father were at odds in the matter. So I said, "No, he was addressing his son." "Ah! And he seemed to be angry?" "He did." "Then they were quarreling?" "As to that I cannot say. I merely tell you what I saw: that Mr. Van Wyck was addressing his son, and that he had the appearance of being angry." The coroner excused me then, and turning to Morland, said directly, "Did you quarrel with your father last evening?" "I told him what I thought of his procedure," replied Morland. "I make no secret of the fact that I tried my best to persuade my father not to give away his fortune." "And do you persist in your assertion that when you left your father at midnight his secretary was still with him?" "I do," said Morland firmly. "And you deny this, Mr. Lassiter?" "I do," replied the secretary quite as positively. This deadlock was a peculiar feature of the situation. Both men could not be telling the truth, and considering Morland's greater reason for desiring that the great gift should not be made, perhaps it was not strange that many of the audience began to turn upon him the eye of suspicion. Everybody now had testified, and the coroner began summing up. "I have had no direct evidence," he said, "that would tend to cast suspicion on any person. I think we must all admit that since the room was locked and barred on the inside, Mr. Van Wyck's death was not a murder. I think the erratic mind of the deceased gives us reason to assume a sudden attack of insanity. I think we must agree that if it was suicide, there was no possible means or method, unless we accept the really clever suggestion of the icicle." At this point Mr. Markham interrupted the coroner. "I think we may discard the icicle theory," he said, "as I have found the weapon with which the crime was committed. Here it is." Stepping forward, he laid on the table in front of the coroner a small sharp implement partly covered with brownish stains. The coroner looked at it as if he could scarcely believe his eyes. "What is it?" he said, picking it up gingerly. "It is an implement used in embroidering," said Mr. Markham. "It is called a stiletto, and it forms part of every lady's sewing equipment." The audience were fairly breathless with suspense. Swayed by the slightest hint, they were quite ready to drop suspicion of Morland and turn it toward the women of the family. "Where did you find this?" said the coroner. "In Mrs. Van Wyck's dressing room," returned the detective. "Is it your property?" asked the coroner of Anne. "Yes," she replied, after a glance at the stiletto. "It belongs in my work basket." "Can you account for these stains upon it?" pursued the coroner, and he showed far more agitation than did the woman he addressed. "I cannot," she replied coldly. "I have never used it except for embroidery purposes." Now, of course, if Anne Van Wyck had used this implement for the purpose of killing her husband she could scarcely be expected to say so; and so her flat denial carried little weight. "Where in the dressing room was it found?" asked the coroner. "Hidden beneath a pile of towels in a cupboard," replied Mr. Markham. Whereupon the coroner inquired of Dr. Mason if the stiletto would have been a possible instrument of death. "Mr. Van Wyck was stabbed with some weapon about that size," replied the doctor gravely. "And are these brownish stains upon it stains of blood?" "That I cannot tell you without subjecting them to analysis," returned the doctor, but his hearers were impressed with the thought that he was endeavoring to delay to give Anne the benefit of the doubt. "I think," went on the coroner, in a hesitating manner, "that this piece of evidence must change the trend of our inquiries. Mrs. Van Wyck, did you, or did you not, put this stiletto in the place where it was found?" "I did not," replied Anne quietly. "Do you know who did place it there?" "I do not." "Of course," said the coroner, "the discovery of this instrument in this condition does not necessarily implicate its owner. Other hands might have used it and secreted it where it was found, perhaps with the intent of diverting suspicion. Who has the care of your dressing room, Mrs. Van Wyck?" "My maid, Jeanette." "Let her be summoned," the coroner ordered. But Jeanette was nowhere to be found. She had disappeared, no one knew when or where. To the minds of most present this looked suspicious. It was easily to be seen that the villagers were quite ready to denounce Anne Van Wyck as the slayer of her own husband. Anne had never been popular with the village people. Clever and highly strung as she was, she had found little in common with their ordinary and to her stupid pursuits. And now they were quite ready to believe the worst of her. Anne herself looked supercilious and scornful. "I have no notion where my maid has gone," she stated, "but I am positive that she is in no way implicated in this tragedy. She may have gone on some errand, and will doubtless return soon. I am entirely sure she can give you no information or enlightenment as to the crime that has been committed in this house, any more than I can." "And you can tell us nothing, Mrs. Van Wyck, more than we know already?" the coroner said, floundering a little in the complexity of his emotions. "No," replied Anne quietly. The coroner fidgeted uneasily, and then said, "It is impossible to carry matters further without the testimony of the maid Jeanette. I therefore declare this inquest adjourned for a few days, by which time I trust we may have further and more definite evidence." The jury, to a man, looked decidedly relieved, but it was a rather disappointed audience that filed slowly out of the house. To my mind, the coroner's reason for adjourning the inquest was a pretext. I think he felt sure that if the jury had had to decide then and there they must have accused Anne of the murder. And the evidence was certainly incriminating. While I felt with every fibre of my being the wish and desire to hold Anne innocent, yet there was something terribly convincing of guilt in the fact of that hidden stiletto. But again, the absurdity of it! How was it humanly possible, even granting that Anne had used the fatal instrument, for her to leave the study so securely locked and bolted on the inside? But that was the old question, and the one to which no one had an answer. But how I hoped the answer might incriminate anybody but Anne! That evening was a strange one. As an experience of my life I shall never forget it. The members of the household all seemed to be at cross purposes. There were a great many people about, with the result that the Van Wycks and their house guests chose the music room for themselves, and denied the others admission. In the library were gathered the coroner and Mr. Markham in confab with Mr. Van Wyck's lawyers, and some directors of the companies with which he had been identified. The ceremony of dinner had been a great strain on us all, but now that we were by ourselves the tension was loosened a little. Anne was verging on the hysterical. She had borne up so long and so bravely against the onslaughts of Mrs. Carstairs that a reaction had set in, and she seemed to lose all her defensive courage. As a result, we all tried to comfort or cheer her, and avoided referring to painful subjects. Archer was gentle and deferential, but he said little to her, and seemed to content himself with watching her closely. Barbara and Morland were in a quarrelsome mood, a condition not unusual with them. Of course it was necessary they should make certain arrangements pertaining to the funeral of their father, and naturally they deferred to Anne in many matters. But Anne listlessly declined to express any opinions, and insisted that they should use their own judgment and settle all questions between themselves. The subject of the stiletto was not so much as mentioned, and indeed the whole great matter of the tragedy and the inquest was not even touched upon. Beth Fordyce was the only one who seemed inclined to open the subject, and she occasionally declared with insistence that Carstairs had killed his master. As we were awaiting the detective's investigation of the valet's affairs, we had no wish to discuss this; or at least if some of us had, we did not want to do so in the presence of the Van Wyck family. I made up my mind to talk alone with Archer later, but at present I considered it my duty to do anything I might to avoid serious or tragic considerations. It seemed to me that Anne became more and more drooping, and at last I begged of her to go for a short walk on the terrace. She agreed more readily than I had hoped, and we went out together. It was an exquisite night, the air soft and balmy, and the moon overhead. "Just for a little while, Anne," I said gently. "Forget it all, can't you? A short respite from these harrowing thoughts will clear your brain and heart, and make you stronger to bear what must come to-morrow." She spoke suddenly, repeating my words in a frightened tone. "What must come to-morrow? What do you mean, Raymond?" I couldn't bring myself to speak of that tell-tale stiletto, so I said, "The whole dreadful business, Anne. The conclusion of the inquest, the detective work that must follow, the funeral, and all the 1,001 accompaniments of this tragedy that has come to you. Just for an hour put it out of your mind, and I know it will help you. Let us talk of things far off and unassociated with this place. Let us talk of when we went to school together." We had left the terrace, and were walking down a path through one of the formal gardens. She gave me a look of trust as she said softly, "You are very good to me, Raymond." "I'm your friend, Anne. It is not being good, as you phrase it, to want to help you in your sadness and trouble." "You are my friend," she said slowly. "Does that mean you trust me? You have faith in me?" "Of course I have. I trust you infinitely. I have unbounded faith in you." Anne's voice sank to a whisper, and she tremblingly said, "You wouldn't if you knew. Oh, Raymond, that is the pity of it. You wouldn't if you knew." I was appalled, not so much by her words as by the despair in her voice. Though I wouldn't admit it to myself, it was like the wail of a guilty conscience. Like a flash, I remembered the peculiar tone of her voice when she had said to me, "I am capable of crime." But I wouldn't believe it. Nothing could make me believe it, not even Anne herself. "Don't talk," I said to her. "You are overwrought to night. You can't see things at their proper value, and you're exaggerating something to yourself. Now I command you," and I endeavored to be playful, "to talk about the moon. How large do you think it is?" Anne smiled involuntarily, for she remembered, as I did, that in our school days it had been one of our games to discuss the apparent size of the moon. But my project was unsuccessful. After a fleeting memory, Anne forgot the moon, and burst out passionately, "Why does that woman hate me so?" I saw that it was useless to try to divert her thoughts, so I concluded to talk with her, and it seemed to me that a direct common-sense attitude would be the best for her. "Anne," I said, "you know very well why she hates you. You know that, whether she told the truth or not when she said Mr. Van Wyck had promised to marry her, she certainly hoped that he would do so; and when he married you instead, it is not surprising that it should anger her against you." "It is more than that," said Anne musingly. "She has for me an animosity beyond that of a jealous rival. She seems uncanny sometimes, and looks at me with what I think must be the evil eye." "Well, granted it is so, Anne, you must rise above it. However she has troubled you in the past, she cannot trouble you any more. After a short time she will go away from here, and you, Anne, you don't expect to stay on here, do you?" "I don't know. I haven't thought about it," and Anne gave a weary little sigh. "I wish I had some one to help me decide these things. Morland and Barbara are so fiery tempered that I can't discuss plans coolly with them. I don't know how the will reads exactly, but I suppose it is thirds. They may have Buttonwood Terrace, if they want it. I don't care. But I don't know where to go myself." "It is a tribute to my own self-control that I didn't tell her what was in my heart concerning her future welfare, but I knew from the tone of her voice that no thought of me as a factor in her future had yet entered her mind. Whether she thought thus of Archer or not I did not know; but surely, while David Van Wyck lay dead in the house, no one could speak of love to this widow. And yet I had a brave hope that time might bring me that for which I longed with my whole heart. "Let the future take care of itself," I responded gently. "What I want, Anne, just now, is for you to pluck up your courage and carry yourself through the ordeal of the next few days as bravely as may be. I have seen you rise above the annoyance of Mrs. Carstairs' presence, and vanquish her with your own superiority. What you have done, you can do again." "But that was before last night," and Anne fairly moaned in despair. "Oh, Raymond, you don't know. You don't know." At that moment we heard a slight sound behind us, and a dark clad form glided by. It was Mrs. Carstairs herself, and as she passed, she murmured, "But I know, Anne Van Wyck. I know." She passed away as swiftly as she had come, and as silently, and I felt Anne's form grow limp and lean against me. I could have carried her to the house, but I did not wish to subject her to a possible mortification. So instead I grasped her arm firmly and whispered in her ear, "Brace up. Now is the time to show what you're made of. Call upon your pride, your dignity, your scorn, whatever you will, but succeed." The force of my voice must have nerved her, for she straightened up and walked with a steady step toward the house. I kept my hold on her arm till we reached the door, and then, seeing one of the maids in the hall, I bade her take Mrs. Van Wyck to her room. Then I went to the smoking room, and though I would not allow myself even to surmise what Anne had meant by her strange words, nor what Mrs. Carstairs had meant by her threatening whisper, I said over and over from the depths of my soul, "Anybody but Anne." 14. A Mysterious Disappearance. I found Archer in the billiard room, and joined him in a chat and a smoke. Though our desultory conversation could scarcely be called a chat, so uncommunicative were we both. But there seemed to be little to say. We agreed that the mystery was inexplicable. We agreed that the criminal, if there had been one, must be tracked down. We agreed that Markham, while a shrewd man and a reasoning one, hadn't done much as yet, but we further agreed he should be allowed more time to show his prowess. I certainly had no intention of telling Archer what Anne had said to me out on the terrace; nor yet what Mrs. Carstairs had said, as she so suddenly appeared and disappeared. And if Archer had any secret information, he was equally determined not to confide in me. We told each other of our intention to remain at Buttonwood Terrace for a few days after the funeral, in the hope of being of some assistance to the family. If to both of us the family was merely a euphemism for Anne Van Wyck, neither of us said so. The talk turned again to Mr. Markham, and I compared him to Fleming Stone. "Why," said I, "Stone would have found the criminal by this time, I'm sure." "How?" asked Archer. "There are no clues." "But there is mystery. I once heard Fleming Stone say that mystery in a case always spurred and enthused him. I wish the Van Wicks would engage him." "I thought somebody said he had gone West," returned Archer moodily, blowing smoke rings into the air. Yes, when he was here yesterday he said he was to start at once. But if Markham doesn't do something soon, I shall advise employing Stone. It's all very well to say Markham must have more time, and all that, but I know what a value Stone places on looking into things before the clues have been destroyed. As you very well know, Archer, he really deduced a lot of truths from that foolish van business yesterday, and you must admit he's unusually clever in that way. I never denied it. I think he is a wonderful detective. But isn't he very expensive? He is, I believe. But the Van Wycks are rich, and they ought to have the best possible expert advice in this matter. While I was speaking, Morland came into the room. The young fellow looked worn and tired, but he had his customary belligerent air as he flung himself astride of a chair and glared at us over its back. I suppose we are rich, but I don't mean to throw money away on spectacular detectives. I heard what you were saying, Sturgis, and I think it's tommyrot to get in that omniscient sleuth you're talking about. My father was killed by somebody. I'm sure I don't know who did it, but if Markham can't find out, nobody can. I don't mean by that I consider Markham such a great detective, but I mean that I think the case is one that can never be solved, and perhaps it's just as well that it shouldn't be." Young Van Wyck sighed deeply, and then frowned as he went on. "I suppose I'm master here now, in a way. I don't mean to question my stepmother's position or authority, but I'm the man of the house, and my wishes ought to have some weight. Especially as Mrs. Van Wyck declines to take any part in the settlement of questions that arise." "Don't you think," I ventured, "that the services of a good detective are really necessary?" "No," Morland thundered. "Not since that stiletto business. Good heavens, man! Do you want to run down that clue?" Archer looked at the speaker as if he would jump at his throat. "You mean to say—" he blazed, and then stopped, unable to voice his own meaning. I felt equally incensed, and thought it better to speak plainly. "Morland," I said, "I wish you'd state in plain terms what you do think." "I don't think anything, and if I did I shouldn't say it. But you must see, both of you, what it all means. And I want to shield Anne in every way I can. Oh, let's not even speak of it. It drives me crazy to think about it." The boy's face, for Morland was not really much more than a boy, was pathetic. He was afraid to face the conclusions which the finding of that stiletto must lead to. Not so Archer. The older man was quiet and composed as he said straightforwardly, "Nothing can be gained by shirking the issue. If we refuse to consider the case, others will do so. Don't you think it's wiser to learn all we can ourselves, and be ready to meet any detective on his own ground? Now look here, Morland, if you are really anxious to shield Mrs. Van Wyck from suspicion, the best way to go about it is to face that stiletto business and run it to earth. I don't believe there's anything in it." "I wish I could think so," and Morland's eyes showed a gleam of hope. "But you fellows don't know how Anne hated the governor." "Hush!" said Archer sternly. "Don't say such things as that." "But it's true," Morland insisted doggedly. "You fellows don't know anything about it. At first they got along pretty well, but lately—well, it wasn't all Anne's fault. Dad certainly made it hard for her, with his domineering ways and unjust rules. But Anne tantalized him, too. And lately they had a lot of quarreling over those pearls. Now, I'm terribly fond of Anne, perhaps more so than I ought to be, but I can't help seeing things as they are. Why, it was a crisis. Last night the governor was going to give away an enormous sum of money, and whether he intended to give the pearls, too, I don't know, but he told Anne that he did." Morland ceased speaking, and indeed no more words were needed. Whatever the facts, he had set forth a theory that was at least plausible. I wouldn't believe a word of it. My heart refused to harbor the faintest suspicion of Anne. But I knew it was only my heart that refused. My brain saw clearly the logic and truth of what Morland had said, and, too, my brain refused to forget Anne's words, "I'm capable of crime." And so, with my heart and brain in dire conflict, I couldn't speak. But Archer spoke. In a cold, even cutting voice he said, "You are, of course, entitled to jump to a conclusion if you wish. You are, of course, at liberty to put the worst possible construction on the evidence of the stiletto. But would you mind informing us how, in your opinion, Mrs. Van Wyck accomplished the diabolical act which you attribute to her, and left the study locked on the inside?" Morland passed his hand wearily over his brow. "I don't know," he said. "Nobody knows. But you must admit that whoever did the diabolical deed managed in some way to leave the study door locked." "Then, until you can discover how that was done," Archer went on, "I think it will be wise for you to refrain from making accusations. I'm an older man than you are, Morland, and I think I have a right to call you down when you pursue such a dangerous course. Even though you feel sure your suspicions are correct, I beg of you do not shout them from the housetop." "I'm not—" began Morland, but I interrupted. "The very fact that the study was left locked so positively points to suicide that I think it would be better to let it go at that. Why not call off the detectives and insist upon a verdict of suicide? The fact that the weapon is missing is no more inexplicable, if as much so, as how the murderer escaped." "I'm sure I'm willing to let it go at that," said Morland, who was now pacing up and down the room with his hands in his pockets. "I'd be glad to stop investigations at once, but I doubt if that's possible." "And then there's Carstairs," said Archer. "That chap certainly has a guilty conscience if anybody ever had. If investigation must be made, can't it be turned in his direction? If he's innocent, it can do no harm, and if he's implicated, we ought to know it. You see, he knew both he and his mother would get big benefit from the death of his master." "At any rate, Morland," I said rather crossly, for my nerves were on edge, "do keep your mouth shut about your suspicions. And if you're head of the house, and if your influence counts for anything, for heaven's sake direct the trend of investigation towards suicide, or Carstairs, or a burglar, or anybody but Anne." "That's well enough to say, but I'm confronted by new suspicions all the time. I have to look over my father's papers, of course, and I have already found enormous bills of Anne's, still unpaid." "Recent bills?" asked Archer. "Fairly so. Within a few months. I've only looked over the papers in the safe so far. Those on the desk I'm going to tackle to morrow. Of course they will be the most recent bills. But I dare say there'll be plenty of them. I suppose all beautiful women are extravagant." "At any rate, Mrs. Van Wyck has money enough now to pay her own bills," I suggested, a little shortly, for I thought Morland unduly interested in the particular matter of Anne's extravagance. "That's true," said Morland, and turning on his heel he strode out of the room. Archer and I were silent after young Van Wyck left us, and it was but a few moments before my companion threw his half-smoked cigar into the fireplace and announced abruptly, "I think I'll turn in." "I'm going up, too," I said, rather relieved that no further conversation was begun. I followed Archer up the small side staircase, which led directly to our quarters, more conveniently than the grand staircase opposite. Archer's room chanced to be directly over David Van Wyck's bedroom, while mine was over Anne's. There were one or two rooms between, I believe, but I don't know who occupied them. We paused for a brief word of good night at the head of the stairs, and then turned our opposite ways. I heard Archer's door close as I was about to open my own, when I suddenly bethought myself that I had meant to ask him what he thought about those contradictory stories of Morland and Lassiter as to which had been left alone with Mr. Van Wyck the night before. It seemed to me that a good deal might hinge on that question, and I wanted Archer's opinion. I didn't altogether like Archer, but I was just enough to know that it was largely due to my jealousy of his friendship for Anne, and in spite of this I had great regard for his opinions, as I had usually found them logical and right-minded. I turned back and walked along the corridor. It was but a moment since we had parted, and I assumed he could not yet be disrobing. I tapped lightly at his bedroom door, but he didn't answer, so I tapped again. Receiving no response, I was a little surprised, but I figured that he thought it was someone else, and not wanting any further discussion that night, he was pretending to be asleep. So I tapped again, saying in a low tone, "It's Sturgis. Let me in a minute, will you?" Still he didn't answer, and in a moment of irritation at his silence I turned the doorknob. The door opened, and as the room was brilliantly lighted I stepped inside. I didn't see Archer, but across the room a door was opened into a bathroom, and I assumed he was in there. "Beg pardon, Archer," I called out, "but I do want to see you a minute, if I may." Still there was no reply, and feeling that the strangeness of the situation justified it, I went to the bathroom door and looked in. The light was turned on, but there was no one in the bathroom. I was bewildered, for I knew that Archer had come in, and I could not imagine what had become of him. There was a door at the farther end of the bathroom, and involuntarily I opened it. However, it was only a clothes closet of good size, but as it contained only a few garments, I closed the door again and returned to Archer's bedroom. As he couldn't have jumped out of the window, it naturally followed that he had left his room and gone downstairs again, while I had stood for a moment in front of my own bedroom door. It didn't seem possible, for the hall was brightly lighted, and I was sure I should have seen or heard him had he passed so near me. I spoke aloud. "Archer," I said, "are you under the bed? Or where? If you are, come out." Again I called his name a trifle louder, and then went out of his room into the hall, closing the door behind me. I walked slowly along toward my own room, pausing at the staircase to look down. At that very moment I heard the click of Archer's door, and turning, I saw him. "Did you want me, Sturgis?" he inquired. "Was that you calling?" I went slowly back and entered his room and closed the door behind us. "Where were you?" I said, staring around curiously. "Where was I when?" he returned with a slight smile. "When I was in here a moment ago. I tapped 3 times and you didn't answer, so I took the liberty of entering, and you weren't here." "Oh, I was in the bathroom," he said lightly. "What is it you want? Cigarettes?" "But you weren't in the bathroom, for I looked in there." I persisted, ignoring his question. He looked at me curiously. "You did?" he exclaimed. "Well, I chanced to be in the clothes closet of the bathroom. It's rather large for the limited wardrobe I brought with me, and I expect I got lost in its depths." "But you weren't there," I said, looking straight at him, "for I looked in there." "Then I can only say your behavior is most ill-bred. I consider you unwarrantably intrusive." Archer's manner was distinctly haughty and his tone even offensive, but the rebuke was deserved, and I responded, "You are quite right. I beg your pardon. And now I will tell you why I came. If you don't mind discussing it, I'd like to know what you make of those conflicting statements of Morland and his father's secretary, as to which remained in the study last night after the other left." Archer considered seriously. "I've thought over that myself," he said. "And, do you know, the thing that most impresses me in connection with that is that it seems to prove them both innocent of any guilty knowledge of this matter." "How so?" I said wonderingly. "Why, because if either of them were guilty, not that I suspect for a moment that either of them is, but for the sake of argument let us suppose it, or if either of them should be concealing any bit of guilty knowledge, surely he would not so flatly give the other the lie, because he would know that such a course would invite investigation. A man with a guilty conscience is plausible and endeavors to be casual. He never makes such a sensational statement and sticks to it so blatantly." "You ought to be a detective yourself, Archer," I said, looking at him admiringly. "I think you've made a very subtle point." "I haven't what are called detective methods," he returned, "but I do hold that reason and logic are the mainstays of the profession. However, something more is needed; for Markham has reason and logic, and yet I doubt if he will get anywhere. I suppose ingenuity and originality are needed. Of course your Fleming Stone has those. But Sturgis," and Archer's face grew very grave, "do we want to push this matter? Neither of us is willing to voice suspicions as Morland did, but shall we not admit to each other that a cessation of all movement in the matter might be a good thing?" "I don't know, Archer," and I looked at him thoughtfully. "I see the force of your suggestion, and yet well, I want to think it over. I'll ponder on it to night, and I know you'll do so. To morrow let us again exchange ideas." Archer agreed to this, though I must confess he didn't seem greatly impressed with the brilliancy of my plan, and I went off to my own room. This time I really entered it and locked the door after me. I threw myself into an arm chair and proceeded to my pondering at once. But I may as well admit that my pondering began, not with the mystery of the tragedy, but with the mystery of Archer's absence from his own room that night. It was all very well for him to say that he was in the bathroom cupboard, but I couldn't believe it, for I had looked in there and saw no one. To be sure, I didn't go inside, but Archer could scarcely have been concealed behind the few coats or trousers that were suspended from rods. Unless he had been in one of his own suitcases or hat boxes, he couldn't have been in that closet, and the more I thought about it the stranger it seemed. And then the jealousy lurking in my heart gave me a sudden suggestion. Archer's room was directly over David Van Wyck's bedroom. Before his marriage, David Van Wyck had used for his own bedroom the very one Archer now occupied. Could there be, hinted my jealous heart, a secret staircase between the two? Could Archer descend secretly to David Van Wyck's room and so gain access to Anne's apartments? It was a tawdry thought, it was melodramatic, but my heart was like a tinder box, and the thought had struck a fiendish flame. I didn't believe it with my brain, but my foolish heart declared it to be the only possible explanation of Archer's mysterious disappearance. And then another thought followed it, which made me ashamed of my evil imagination. The dead body of David Van Wyck lay in his own bedroom. Surely no man would descend to that room on a clandestine errand. So I forced myself to believe Archer had told me the truth, and that he had been in the cupboard, and as soon as he emerged had answered my call. It was a strange circumstance, but not so strange as the bizarre explanation I had conjured up. Besides, Morland had distinctly stated there was no secret staircase or anything of the sort in the house. But, urged my unquiet soul, did Morland know? David Van Wyck was quite capable of keeping such a secret to himself. And then, in a sudden practical mood, I seized a pencil and drew a plan of the room as it must be. On the ground floor a corridor ran between David Van Wyck's room and the south wall of the house, to give access to the study. But as the study was 2 stories high, having no second floor, there was no occasion for this corridor on the second floor of the house, and in Archer's room the corresponding space above the corridor was completely filled by the bathroom and the large clothes cupboard. I knew a little of practical architecture, and I proved to myself beyond doubt that there was no space for the concealed staircase I had imagined. The walls of the old house were substantial enough, but they were by no means the thickness of walls necessary to contain secret staircases or dungeons, such as those I loved to read of in medieval history. I could reckon plainly from what I knew of the rooms just how they connected with each other, and I could account for every inch of space. Moreover, if a secret staircase had led down from the bathroom or the cupboard of Archer's room, it would have dropped plumb into the corridor below, as there was simply no other place for its outlet. I thought even of a spiral staircase, such as that in the study at the end of the musicians' gallery. But I reasoned that was fully 4 feet across, and the walls, as I computed them, were in no case more than 10 inches thick. So, with a certain feeling of reluctance and yet with a sense of relief, I gave up the idea of a concealed connection between Archer's room and the room below, and turned the trend of my ponderings toward the many and complex phases of the greater mystery. But when I finally fell asleep that night, my dreams were all of rope ladders and secret stairways, and even vague visions of an elopement on a pillioned white palfrey with a beautiful lady who strongly resembled Anne Van Wyck. End of chapters 13 and 14.